Opposition to the Stamp Act was more urban than rural, and varied with profession. But the next round of British duties on imports sparked a wider opposition among the colonists. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend duties, a new set of external taxes collected on the goods before they entered colonial markets, and inaugurated stricter enforcement policies. Americans reasserted their opposition to all taxation without representation, but Americans remained loyal. Led by Bostonians, Americans in port cities revived their non-importation agreements. Artisans took to the streets to enforce them. Non-importation appealed to values of self-sufficiency and independence and brought rural people into the community for resistance. Colonial imports from Britain declined by 41% because of these boycotts. In 1768, the Massachusetts House of Representatives sent a circular letter denouncing the Townshend Acts. British officials demanded its repeal, and the governor of Massachusetts shut down the assembly. Threats of violence against royal officials led the British to station troops in Boston. Periodic incidents between soldiers and citizens escalated until in 1770, when soldiers fired on a crowd, killing 7. News of the, quote, Boston Massacre, quote, helped galvanize public opinion against the British. The news of the repeal of the Townshend Acts lessened American resistance.
William Pitt was a popular prime minister in the colonies, but because of illness he had to retire, and the head of the cabinet took his place, a man named Charles Townshend. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The problem was the national debt, because it was too big. There was a lot of unemployment. There were riots all over London and other places in England over high prices, and because the taxes were high, Townshend proposed that they should shift those taxes over to the colonies and make import duties on the colonies on things like lead, glass, paint, paper, and tea. These taxes or import duties were called Revenue Acts. Americans saw this as a British conspiracy to suppress American liberties. In October 1767, a Boston town meeting created a list of things that they were going to boycott from England. Other port cities also followed suit, including Providence, Newport, and New York. Anyone who didn't practice was shunned or targeted. Daughters of Liberty, which was the female version of the Sons of Liberty, produced homemade substitutes. They wove their own cloth. They sold products in the local markets that were made in the colonies. Colonial legislative bodies began passing non-importation acts, all except New Hampshire, which declined. They reduced colonial consumption of British goods by 41%. Ouch. Boston was the center of the agitation. In 1768, the Massachusetts House of Representatives approved a letter drawn up by Samuel Adams. In this letter, he denounced the Townshend Revenue Acts. It also denounced the British plan to make royal officials independent of colonial assemblies, so their salary would be paid not by the assembly, but by the British government. And this took all the power out of the assembly hands. Francis Bernard, governor of Massachusetts, dissolved the legislature in response to this letter. Throughout this crisis, Boston was in complete turmoil. Mobs threatened government officials so that they were so afraid to do their jobs that they even ran away. One customs official seized John Hancock's sloop, the Liberty, for not paying any duties. He was a very vocal opponent of the new duties and all the British government's measures to assert their authority over the colonies. John Hancock was reportedly one of the most wealthy merchants in Boston, and he had become quite a target for customs officials. There were calls that went up all over the town of Boston for people to arm themselves, and the call went out even beyond Boston. By 1768, October 1st, The British, fearing insurrection, occupied Boston with infantrymen and artillery regiments. In New York, Liberty poles, erected by the Sons of Liberty, were promptly destroyed by British troops that were stationed in the colonies. These poles were often decorated with banners and flags proclaiming their causes. Sometimes confrontations between the Sons of Liberty and the British soldiers would even include British bayonets and colonial swords and clubs. In Boston, tensions continued to grow with the help of the people like Samuel Adams, spurring everyone on and spreading rumors and reports of British atrocities. There was a lot of name-calling. They were overly litigious towards British soldiers. That means they took them to court frequently over small things. The courts were biased against the British soldiers, and there was a lot of labor competition. Soldiers were allowed to have a job when they were off duty. So they would try to find work in town, and it was a competition between soldiers and other colonial workers. One incident, when an off-duty soldier tried to gain work in a rope-making factory, was rudely rejected. He was greatly offended, and he brought back some of his friends to try to even the score or rough them up a bit. And it started a brawl which turned into a riot. Fighting continued for the next several days. This really freaked out the Colonial Assembly, and it freaked out the government, the British government as well. On March 5th, 1770, a crowd gathered in front of the customs house and taunted the guards. The captain and several of his soldiers went to rescue the guard, but the crowd pelted them with snowballs with stones in them. The soldiers began to fire without orders. Five in the crowd were killed, and there were 6 wounded, 2 dying later of their wounds. A man who was half African and half Indian, American Indian, named Crispus Attucks, died first. The mob demanded vengeance. The event became known as the Boston Massacre, and it was infamous throughout the colonies, a reminder to many colonists of the extent to which the relations between the mother country and the colonies had deteriorated. Parliament, without knowing it, repealed most of those Townshend Acts that the colonialists were fighting over on the same day that the Boston Massacre happened, March 5th, 1770. The only tax that they kept was a face-saving measure, and it was the tea-on tax. And this tax was simply to show Parliament's supremacy over the colonists.